Today let's take some Barnwood lumber and build a dining table base. Hey everyone, how's it going? So a couple of years ago my in-laws renovated their kitchen and they asked me to build them a table using some reclaimed barnwood. In the previous video I went over harvesting the barnwood out of the wall of the barn and turning it into usable lumber. At this point the base materials are already stabilized, planed, squared, rough ends cut off, all of that fun stuff, and I've already gone through and decided which sides I want to use as the show sides. So if you wanted to see the process of that, you can check that video out up here. Now with all of that material ready to go, the next step is joinery. First, by finding center on the tops and bottoms of the two I-frame legs and marking out around the entire board with a square and marking knife. Then breaking out the depth gauge and setting it to approximately 1/3 of the 4x4 legs, I can mark out the two side offcuts of the tops and bottoms and centers of the uprights and getting them ready for removal. Making sure to color in the sections to be removed with a pencil so I don't screw up, which I didn't. To do that, I started off using a handsaw and chisels to take out the waste, however that was taking way too long and wasn't nearly as accurate as I would like. So for the tops and bottoms outer waste removal, I break out the circular saw with the blade set to the same 1/3 depth and a speed square to keep the saw straight on at least the first two outer cuts, and then remove the bulk of the waste with a series of cuts where now I can just break out the remaining material and clean up with a chisel. For the uprights, I attempted the pull saw and chisels again, which worked a little bit better than before, but still ridiculously slow. So I broke out my oscillating saw and cleared out the majority of the waste with that instead. In the past, I've typically only used the oscillating saw when I'm cutting drywall or I'm trying to do more surgical demolition. This is the first time I've tried it for joinery, and I was actually pretty impressed with how well it worked out. Since the blade really only vibrates a 1/4 inch back and forth, it was still pretty easy to see where it was going to be cutting and adapt as required to keep it parallel with the marking line. I should try it with some dovetails at some point, just to see how it works out. With the bulk of the waste material now cleared out, I can work on the final fitment with the chisel and occasionally the random orbit sander to take off just a touch and slowly carve away at the joinery before the two pieces slip together, and repeated that process another 3 times to finish off the main portion of the legs. With the two leg assemblies now completed, it's time to connect them. I'm gonna go with 2 top stretchers and 1 lower center stretcher, starting with the center stretcher. The center stretcher is connected to the leg assemblies with a mortise and tenon joint, so I jump over to the bandsaw and start cutting the tenons. I set the fence at a 1/2 inch and a stop block 4 1/4 inches back from the front of the blade to allow a little bit of extra length to be cut flush after the fact, off the tenon. After I cut the waste sides off of the tenon with the pull saw, and a little bit of cleanup in the corner with the chisel, I noticed that the tenon ended up a little bit more trapezoidal than square, which isn't all that useful for a mortise and tenon. I guess my bandsaw isn't quite as tuned up as it should be. To fix this, I would take it to my crosscut sled and clean up the tenon on the table saw, though unfortunately I still haven't built a new one from when I accidentally cut it in half. It's on the list of projects. I also don't really have the time to dedicate to building a new sled at the moment, so I ended up just buying a new miter gauge, since I didn't have one anyway. And it only took me an hour to do, as opposed to losing half a day to building a new sled. I figured it was a good investment, and I'm actually quite impressed with it. After the tenon was cleaned up, I figured I would set the center stretcher off to the side for now, and turn my attention back to the leg assemblies. Since I still had the miter gauge set up, I chamfered the bottom corners of the two tops and knocked out the top corners to allow for the half lap that the top stretchers require, with a little bit more corner cleanup with the chisel. Now turning my attention over to the top stretchers, I chamfered the bottom outer corner along the entire length, popped the miter gauge back onto the table saw, and did 1 pass on the table saw to finalize the distance of the other half of the half lap. I would have taken out the corner in multiple passes like I did with the waste on the legs or the tenons. However, the stretchers were only riding on the mitered end and really weren't all that stable, so I took out the rest of the waste with the oscillating saw and just kept it as square as I could, coming back and cleaning up with a chisel at the end. At this point, I figured I did enough work. I earned myself a little bit of a sneak peek to the final product. Man, I'm happy. That looks good. I'm gonna have to shave the tops of the legs down 1/8 of an inch. I'm very happy. This is fantastic. And now with all of the distractions out of the way, I could turn my attention back to the center stretcher, or at least the mortise portions of the center stretcher. After marking out the mortise location on the uprights of the leg assemblies, I threw an auger bit into my drill and began hogging out the majority of the waste. And again, tried to use the chisel to clear out the rest, but was still taking too long, so oscillating saw it is. Once the mortise was cleared out, I swapped over to a file for the finessing on both the mortise and the tenon. Oh, let's just hit that with some CA glue and activator. Don't want that knot coming loose while I'm trying to fit these together. With enough back and forth, I was able to get the tenons in the mortises and everything together again for another test fit. I guess I'm pretty much on glue up. With all of the joinery now cut, it's time for the multi-stage glue up, using some sacrificial pieces to make sure I'm not marring up the faces, and doing my best to make sure everything is square. The first step being attach the bottom of the legs to the uprights. Second step is top of the legs to the rest of the leg assembly. Each glue step had more or less 24 hours to dry. Not that it needed that long, it just worked out better for me timeline-wise between sleeping and the day job and all that fun stuff. Next up is the center stretcher into the leg assemblies, but here I decided to go with wedged tenons. So I cut some kerfs into the tenon on the bandsaw as well as some wedges, which I sanded to clean up. And then with some glue I can knock the leg assemblies and stretcher together and knock the wedges into the tenons. In hindsight, I should have gone with something a little bit harder than the Barnwood scraps, maybe some maple or something, but I was more focused on keeping the lumber looking relatively consistent. One of the last glue up steps is the side stretchers, but they will require a little bit more work before I can glue them down. I moved the table base down onto the shop floor and made sure that the base was level, to, in theory, make sure that there wasn't going to be a twist in the table. We'll see how successful I was later on. Moving back to the top stretchers. Unfortunately, my measurements of the half lap were a little bit screwy, so the top stretchers didn't line up with the tops of the base. Off camera, I whipped up a quick zero clearance insert for my table saw and raided my scrap bin for the original cutoff of the half lap, since it was already the correct size I would need. Then I could rip off several shims just to bring the stretcher back up to the tops of the legs. Took a couple of tries to get the right thickness for the shims, but I got there eventually. The shims were glued and taped down, and the next day I glued down the stretchers, which was probably one of the more complex clamping processes of this whole project. Before I can call the base complete, I remember I need to add in some feet. I had this last full board since this one was too thin to be used in the tabletops, which will be the next video that you can check out up here if it is out by now. Over at the table saw, I cleaned up the two sides and cut it to the same width of the legs. Ripped the board down to just over 3/4 inch thickness over at the bandsaw. Planed the rough sawn face smooth over at the thickness planer. Fill in the couple air bubbles with some CA glue and activator. Sand the glue smooth with the random orbit sander. Back over at the table saw, I break out the miter gauge, set the stop block to the same thickness as the legs, and cut off 4 segments. Now that I've made a couple coasters, I tossed the miter gauge and beveled the blade to 45 degrees and lopped all of the top corners of the 4 coasters. Now that the table coasters are done, I just need to glue them onto the table legs, using some painter's tape to hold them in place until I can get the clamps on until the glue dries. And with that, I think I'm going to call the video here. I still have quite a bit of work to go on this project, but I'm going to split those into their own videos that you can check out in the playlist up here in the following weeks, if they aren't up there already. The next video will be going over assembling the 3 separate tabletops and figuring out the leaf extension hardware. Should be a good time. And with that, thank you all for watching, and if you like what I'm doing here, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more. If you have any questions or comments, I look forward to seeing them in the comment section below, and if you want to see more up-to-date projects, you can always follow me on Instagram at John the Schreiner. Otherwise, I will see you here in the next video, and have a good one.